I still remember that day like it was yesterday. It's funny how some moments stick with you, even when you're too young to fully understand their meaning. We were in preschool, just 4 years old, and sitting cross-legged on the colorful alphabet rug in Mrs. Peterson's classroom. The air smelled faintly of crayons and glue sticks, and sunlight streamed through the windows, making everything feel warm and golden. Circle time had just ended, and we'd finished singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. I don't know what made me ask the question. Maybe it was the way Ethan always seemed so sure of himself, or maybe it was because he was my best friend, and I couldn't imagine life without him. Whatever it was, I turned to him, looked him straight in the eye, and asked, "Will you marry me when we grow up?" Ethan didn't laugh or hesitate. Instead, he gave me this big, toothy grin, the kind only a preschooler could pull off, and said, "Yes," just like that. No questions, no second guessing. He promised right then and there, loud enough for the whole class to hear. Some kids giggled, but most went back to playing with blocks or coloring pictures. To them, it probably sounded like one of those silly things kids say all the time. But to me, it felt real, important, like we'd just sealed a deal that couldn't be broken. From that day on, Ethan and I became inseparable. During nap time, we'd whisper about our future together. He'd tell me he wanted a dog named Max, and I'd say we should live in a house with a swing set in the backyard. At snack time, we shared cookies and talked about where we'd go on vacation. Hawaii, according to Ethan, because he saw it on TV once and thought it looked cool. Our imaginations ran wild, and every little detail felt possible because we had each other. Our parents found it adorable. They'd tease us gently, calling Ethan my boyfriend, and asking if he planned to keep his promise. My mom even joked that she'd save the date for our wedding. Back then, none of us realized how fleeting those days would be. Life has a way of changing quickly, especially when you're young. One summer morning, Ethan's mom came to pick him up early from school. She hugged me goodbye and said they were moving away. "Don't worry," she added kindly. "We'll visit soon." But they never did. That summer felt endless. I cried more than I ever had before, clutching the little toy car Ethan gave me as a parting gift. I told myself he'd come back someday, that people who made promises like ours didn't just disappear. As the years passed, though, reality set in. Ethan wasn't coming back. Life moved forward, and so did I. Friends, schoolwork, sports. They filled the spaces where memories of Ethan used to live. Yet no matter how much time went by, I couldn't forget the boy who promised to marry me when we grew up. It's strange, isn't it, how something so small can leave such a lasting mark. Even now, decades later, I wonder if Ethan remembers that promise. Did he think about it as often as I did? Or did it fade into the background of his childhood, forgotten along with the rest of those innocent days? Part of me hoped he hadn't forgotten. Because deep down, I believed in that promise, not just as a memory, but as a thread connecting us across time and distance. A reminder that sometimes the simplest words carry the deepest meaning. Life without Ethan felt quieter, emptier, like a song missing its melody. At first, I tried to fill the void by throwing myself into everything around me: school, hobbies, friendships. But no matter how busy I stayed, there was always this tiny corner of my heart that felt incomplete. It wasn't just sadness, it was longing, a strange, unshakable feeling that something, or someone, was missing. As the years went by, people stopped asking about Ethan. My parents rarely mentioned him anymore, and even my closest friends seemed to forget about the boy who once promised to marry me. But I didn't. How could I? That promise lingered in the back of my mind, tucked away like an old photograph you can't bear to throw out. Sometimes, late at night, I'd lie awake imagining what Ethan looked like now. Was he still the same confident kid with the big grin, or had he changed completely? Did he ever think about me, about the little girl who asked him to marry her all those years ago? High school brought new distractions, crushes, dances, drama. but none of it felt real to me. Sure, I dated a few guys, but nothing stuck. No one made me laugh the way Ethan used to. No one understood me without needing explanations, and no one ever came close to making me feel the way I did when he said yes to my question. Deep down, I wondered if I was holding on to something that didn't exist anymore. Maybe Ethan had moved on, forgotten about our promise entirely, or maybe he thought it was silly, just another childhood memory buried under layers of growing up. My friends teased me relentlessly about my childhood fiancé. They'd joke about inviting him to my wedding or setting up a booth for him at family reunions. "You're never gonna let this go, are you?" they'd say, laughing. And honestly, I didn't want to. Even though it sounded ridiculous to everyone else, that promise meant something to me. It wasn't just words, it was hope. Hope that somewhere out there, the person I was meant to be with remembered me too. But as time passed, doubt crept in. What if fate didn't care about promises made on alphabet rugs? What if life really was as random as people said, and Ethan and I were never meant to meet again? These thoughts haunted me, especially during quiet moments when the world felt still and heavy. I started wondering if I was clinging to a fantasy instead of facing reality. After all, we weren't kids anymore. People grow up, change, lose touch. Maybe it was time to let go. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that our story wasn't over. There were nights when I'd stare at the stars outside my bedroom window and whisper his name, half expecting the universe to answer. Silly, right? But part of me believed, in spite of everything, that Ethan and I shared something special, something timeless, like two puzzle pieces separated by distance, but destined to fit together eventually. By the time I reached my 20s, I told myself I'd moved on. I focused on building a life for myself, landing a steady job, renting a cozy apartment, spending weekends exploring the city with friends. On paper, things looked great, but inside that empty space remained. It wasn't loneliness exactly, it was more like waiting. Waiting for something I couldn't quite name. Waiting for someone who might not even remember me. And then, one rainy Saturday afternoon, everything changed. It was one of those dreary Saturday afternoons where the rain seemed to stretch endlessly, tapping against windows and turning streets into shimmering mirrors. I had been working late at the office, trying to finish up a project before Monday rolled around. And by the time I stepped outside, the downpour showed no signs of stopping. My umbrella was buried somewhere in the depths of my closet. I hadn't needed it in weeks, and I wasn't about to brave the storm unprotected. So, like any sensible person would do, I ducked into the nearest coffee shop. The place smelled heavenly, like freshly ground beans and warm pastries, and the hum of quiet conversations filled the air. It was cozy, almost comforting, though I didn't expect much from the visit beyond a caffeine boost and a brief escape from the weather. I joined the line, scrolling through emails on my phone as droplets slid off my coat onto the tile floor. That's when I heard it, a laugh that stopped me cold. It wasn't just any laugh. It was familiar, deep but light-hearted, with an ease that felt like home. My heart skipped a beat, and without thinking, I turned toward the sound. And there he was, Ethan, standing near the counter, holding a cup of coffee, looking every bit like the boy I remembered, but also completely different. He was taller now, his shoulders broader, his features sharper, his dark hair was slightly messy. And his eyes, those same eyes that used to sparkle with mischief back in preschool, still held the same warmth. For a moment, neither of us moved. Time seemed to freeze as our eyes locked across the room. Then recognition flickered in his expression, followed by disbelief. "Clara," he said softly, his voice tinged with awe. "Ethan," I managed to reply, my throat tightening with emotion. I wanted to say more, to ask how he was, what he'd been doing all these years, but words failed me. Instead, I stood there, staring at him, half convinced I was dreaming. He set his coffee down and walked over, his steps slow and deliberate, as if he couldn't believe this was real either. When he reached me, we hugged awkwardly, laughing and crying all at once. The hug lasted longer than it probably should have, but neither of us pulled away. It felt like coming home. "I can't believe it's you," Ethan said finally, pulling back to look at me. "What are the chances?" "I was going to ask you the same thing," I replied, wiping tears from my cheeks. I didn't think I'd ever see you again." He smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. Life has a funny way of surprising us, doesn't it? We sat down together at a small table by the window, the rain still pouring outside. For the next hour, we talked nonstop, catching up on 2 decades of missed memories. He told me about his family moving away, growing up in a new town, struggling to fit in during middle school. I shared stories about my own life, high school dramas, college adventures, and the ups and downs of adulthood. There were moments when we laughed so hard we nearly cried, and others when silence fell between us, heavy with unspoken emotions. At one point, Ethan leaned forward, his expression serious. "Do you ever wonder why things happen the way they do?" he asked quietly. "Like, why we lost touch for so long, only to run into each other like this?" I nodded slowly. "All the time." "Maybe it's fate," he suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or maybe we're just lucky." Whatever it was, sitting there with him, watching the rain blur the world outside, I couldn't help but feel like the universe had finally given us a second chance. Over the next few weeks, Ethan and I fell into a rhythm of reconnecting that felt both natural and surreal. It was as if no time had passed, yet everything was different. We started meeting regularly, sometimes for coffee, other times for dinner or long walks through the park. Each encounter brought new stories, laughter, and moments that reminded me why I'd held on to his memory for so long. But beneath the surface, there was an unspoken tension neither of us dared to address directly: the promise. That childhood vow lingered in the air between us, invisible but undeniable. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was something deeper, something we couldn't ignore. Yet bringing it up felt risky, like opening a door we weren't sure we were ready to walk through. What if revisiting that memory ruined what we were rebuilding? What if it turned out to mean nothing to him now? One evening, as we strolled along the riverbank under a sky painted with streaks of orange and pink, Ethan finally broke the silence. "Do you remember what we promised each other when we were kids?" he asked softly, his voice hesitant. My breath caught in my throat. Of course I remembered. How could I forget? But hearing him say it aloud made my heart race. "How could I not?" I replied, trying to keep my tone light despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. He smiled faintly, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Did you ever think, maybe it wasn't just a game? That maybe it meant something?" Tears welled up before I could stop them, blurring the horizon ahead of us. I blinked rapidly, willing myself not to cry, but the weight of his words hit me harder than I expected. "I hoped it did," I admitted quietly. "But life gets complicated, doesn't it?" "It does," he agreed, his gaze fixed on the water rippling beside us. "But sometimes complications make room for second chances." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the river and the distant chirping of birds settling in for the night. I wanted to ask him what he meant, whether he believed fate had brought us back together for a reason, but the question stuck in my throat. Instead, I found myself saying, "Do you think people can pick up where they left off after so much time?" Ethan stopped walking and turned to face me. His expression was thoughtful, almost tender. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I think it's worth finding out." There was something about the way he looked at me then, like he saw not just the person I'd become, but also the little girl who once asked him to marry her. It made my chest ache in the best possible way. For years, I'd wondered if I romanticized our connection, if I clung to a memory because it was easier than facing reality. But standing there with Ethan, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized this wasn't just about the past. It was about the present. and maybe even the future. As we continued our walk, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, but the promise lingered in my mind like a melody I couldn't shake. Maybe Ethan was right. Maybe life's complications weren't roadblocks. Maybe they were stepping stones leading us somewhere meaningful. And maybe, just maybe, fate hadn't forgotten about us after all. As magical as our reunion felt, reality wasn't far behind. Ethan and I weren't the same wide-eyed children who made promises on that colorful alphabet rug. We were adults now, carrying the weight of years. Years filled with heartbreaks, responsibilities, and dreams that didn't always come true. Reconnecting was beautiful, but it also brought challenges we couldn't ignore. For starters, Ethan seemed hesitant to dive into anything too serious. "What if this is just nostalgia talking?" he asked one evening as we sat on a park bench, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. "What if we're forcing something because of what happened back then?" His words stung, not because they were harsh, but because I understood them. I'd asked myself the same questions countless times. Was I holding on to a memory instead of seeing Ethan for who he truly was today? Or worse, was I trying to recreate something that only existed in my mind? Still, there was no denying the connection between us. It wasn't just about shared history. It was about how comfortable I felt around him. With Ethan, I could be completely myself, the good, the bad, and everything in between. He listened when I talked, really listened, and his laughter still had the power to light up even my darkest days. But love isn't just about comfort or familiarity. It's about trust, vulnerability, and choosing each other despite the risks. One afternoon, as we walked through a bustling farmer's market, Ethan stopped suddenly in front of a stall selling handmade jewelry. He picked up a delicate silver bracelet, turning it over in his hands. "Do you remember when we used to trade toys during snack time?" he asked with a nostalgic smile. "You always gave me your best stuff. I wanted you to like me," I admitted, laughing softly. "Plus, you had those awesome dinosaur stickers." He chuckled, but then his expression grew serious. "I liked you anyway, Clara, even before the stickers." His words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "Do you think we can make this work?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "After all this time?" Ethan hesitated, his fingers tracing the edge of the bracelet. "I want to try," he said slowly, "but we have to be honest, with ourselves, and with each other. This isn't press school anymore. Life is messy, and people change. If we're going to do this, we need to figure out who we are now, not just who we were." His honesty struck a chord deep within me. Love wasn't about pretending everything was perfect. It was about embracing imperfections and working through them together. And while the idea scared me, terrified me, even, I realized I didn't want to let go. Not again. Over the next few weeks, we took things slow, navigating the complexities of adult relationships while honoring the bond we'd shared as kids. There were moments of doubt, of course. Times when I wondered if we were rushing into something neither of us was ready for. But there were also moments of pure joy, like the rainy Sunday we spent baking cookies and laughing until tears streamed down our faces, or the quiet evenings where we simply sat side by side, content in each other's presence. Through it all, I began to see Ethan not just as the boy from my childhood, but as the man standing beside me now. Strong, kind, flawed, and real. And I realized something important. Love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone who makes you want to be better, not because they demand it, but because they inspire it. By the time autumn leaves started falling, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever lay ahead, I wanted to face it with Ethan. To ease our fears and uncertainties, Ethan and I decided to take things slow. No grand declarations, no rushing into anything, just moments. Small, beautiful moments that reminded us why we mattered to each other. We weren't trying to recreate the past. Instead, we were building something new, something rooted in who we were now while honoring the connection we'd always shared. There was the time Ethan surprised me with tickets to a concert I'd been dying to see. He showed up at my apartment door, holding 2 tickets behind his back, grinning like he'd just pulled off the greatest prank. "I heard this band is your favorite," he said casually, though I could tell he was proud of himself. That night, standing shoulder to shoulder in the crowd, singing along to songs that felt like they were written just for us, I realized how much joy he brought into my life. It wasn't about the big gestures. It was about knowing me, truly knowing me, and going out of his way to make me happy. Then there was the rainy Sunday afternoon when we attempted to bake cookies together. Neither of us was particularly skilled in the kitchen, so it quickly turned into a flour-covered disaster. At one point, Ethan accidentally dumped an entire cup of sugar onto the counter, sending us both into fits of uncontrollable laughter. By the end of the day, the cookies were slightly burnt, but the memory of that afternoon became one of my most treasured. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. Those imperfections made it real, and real was enough. One evening, as we strolled through the city lights after dinner, Ethan stopped abruptly and took my hands in his. The streets were alive with energy, neon signs reflecting off puddles left by an earlier rainstorm. For a moment, he just looked at me, his eyes searching mine as if trying to memorize every detail. "Clara," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "do you remember what we promised each other when we were kids?" My heart skipped a beat. Of course I remembered. How could I forget? "I know it sounds crazy," he continued, "but sometimes I think about that promise and wonder, what if it wasn't just a game? What if it meant something?" Tears pricked my eyes, but I smiled through them. "It did mean something," I whispered. "It still does." He nodded slowly, as if relieved to hear me say it. "I don't want to rush anything," he admitted, "but I also don't want to waste any more time pretending this doesn't matter. Because it does. You do." His words wrapped around me like a warm blanket, chasing away the lingering doubts I'd carried for so long. Maybe love isn't supposed to be easy or predictable. Maybe it's messy and scary and full of questions without clear answers. But standing there with Ethan, feeling his hands in mine and hearing the sincerity in his voice, I knew one thing for certain. I wanted to keep moving forward with him. As the weeks turned into months, those small moments added up, creating a foundation stronger than either of us had anticipated. We learned to navigate disagreements, to lean on each other during tough times, and to celebrate the little victories along the way. Love, I realized, wasn't about finding someone flawless. It was about finding someone willing to grow with you, to face life's challenges side by side. And somewhere between baking disasters and late-night talks under the stars, I stopped wondering if fate had brought us back together. Instead, I started believing that maybe fate had been guiding us all along, not to relive the past, but to create a future worth fighting for. Months later, I found myself standing at the altar in a dress that shimmered like sunlight on water. My hands trembled slightly as I clutched my bouquet, but my heart was steady, calm, even. Across from me stood Ethan, tall and handsome in his suit, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade away. The church was filled with family and friends, their faces glowing with happiness, but all I could see was him. During his vows, Ethan paused and grinned mischievously, the same grin I'd fallen in love with decades ago. "Remember that promise we made in preschool?" he teased, earning laughter from the crowd. Turns out, I meant it. Tears blurred my vision as I nodded, unable to speak. So did I. As we exchanged rings and sealed our commitment with a kiss, I felt something click into place. A sense of completeness I'd been searching for my entire life. It wasn't just about fulfilling a childhood promise. It was about choosing each other over and over again, despite the years and challenges that tried to pull us apart. Later that evening, during the reception, Ethan pulled me onto the dance floor for our first dance as husband and wife. The music swirled around us, soft and romantic, but I barely noticed. All I could focus on was the warmth of his hand in mine, the way his arms felt like home, and the realization that this was only the beginning of our story. You know, he whispered as we swayed together, I used to think fate brought us back together. But now, I think it's more than that. What do you mean? I asked, tilting my head to look at him. I think we chose each other, he said simply. Fate gave us a second chance, but we're the ones who decided to take it. His words stayed with me long after the night ended, echoing in my mind whenever doubts crept in or life got complicated. Love isn't just about destiny or luck. It's about effort, about showing up even when it's hard, about believing in something bigger than yourself and trusting that the person beside you feels the same way. Years have passed since that day, and while life hasn't always been easy, it's been beautiful. We faced challenges, celebrated victories, and built a life full of laughter, memories, and endless cups of coffee. Our journey hasn't been perfect, but it's been ours. And that's what makes it special. Sometimes, late at night, I'll catch Ethan staring at me with that same look of wonder he had the day we reconnected in the coffee shop. What? I'll ask, smiling. Nothing. He'll reply, shaking his head, just thinking about how lucky I am. And every time, without fail, I'll feel the same rush of gratitude I did back then. Because no matter how many years go by, I still can't believe he's mine. The boy who promised to marry me in press school became the man who kept that promise, and in doing so, proved that some connections are timeless. Fate may have stepped in to guide us, but it was our choice to stay. And that choice, to fight for each other, to believe in us, is what turned a childhood promise into a lifetime of love.